So in this short lecture, we are going to be talking about how social programs slash social welfare really kind of evolved in American history. And what a social program or social welfare is, these are going to be programs that are put in place, that are created, that are funded through tax revenue that we pay taxes into. And usually social programs are divided into two main categories. You have one category of social programs that are based on need. These are people that maybe have low incomes, and so it's based on their needs. So examples of that would be Medicaid, WIC, food stamps, Pell Grants, Section 8 housing. But you also have other types of social programs or social welfare that's based on people earning it. And a category of that would be veterans benefits. So we all pay into the system to help fund the GI Bill, VA hospitals, things like that. So it's important to understand that social programs are not just about low-income families. There are other categories as well. So we're kind of going to go through a trip through time. We'll start off before the United States became the United States. We're going to take a look at colonial America. A very difficult time to live here. There weren't any safety nets. The government hasn't been created. We haven't really broken away from England at this point. We had a lot of immigrants coming into the U.S. trying to create a brand new country. And so this was, in a lot of ways, survival of the fittest. This was a very harsh time to live. The average life expectancy of Americans during this time was around 35 years old, which is not old at all. The average life expectancy now is in the late 70s, the upper 70s, and the early 80s. So a lot of people died from communicable diseases, influenza, various types of infections, just like a simple cut. If you're outside farming, you get a simple cut. They didn't have antibiotics and vaccinations and all those things that we have today that have allowed us to live so much longer. So this is a situation where people are relying on each other. The government's not in place to really help out with food stamps or Social Security or anything like that. And so people had to rely on each other. Family relied on family, neighbor relied on neighbor. Sometimes they would get involved with the church and they would have various types of collections or food to help out whenever people got sick. This is a time period where people really had to lean on each other to survive. Now, as we move into where the United States actually became the United States. So now we're in the 1800s, the 1900s, time period where we've kind of gone through the American Revolution. We've broken away from England. We've gone through the Industrial Revolution. Our population is growing dramatically. It's changing extensively. We've discussed in this class before how sociology was created out of the Industrial Revolution and how there was a lot of growth that happened, a lot of prosperity, but there were also a lot of problems that came out of this as well. So Clara Barton is a nurse. She was a nurse during the Civil War, and after the Civil War had ended, she helped create the American Red Cross. The American Red Cross is not a social program. It's not something that we all pay into, but it's an example of how nonprofit organizations started to be kind of created where people could make donations to really kind of help the greater good. So the American Red Cross was started in 1881. This was a time of the Civil War Reconstruction, where the United States really did literally rip itself apart. And so there was several years where we really had to kind of reconstruct the United States. So nonprofit organizations like the American Red Cross were created during that time, and they're still around today, providing food, shelter. Also during natural disasters, the American Red Cross today will even kind of step in and try to help out. But it's really kind of important to understand historically where they actually came from. Now, public schools, this is a social program because we all pay into this. K through 12 is free, regardless if you come from a lower income family, middle class, or wealthy. And if you remember, we did discuss Jane Addams. Jane Addams was the mother of, do you remember? Social work. Very good. That's right. The mother of social work. She also started Hull House in Chicago. She received the Nobel Peace Prize as well. But she was also at the forefront of helping to pass child labor laws to get kids out of factories, out of the coal mines, and started to mandate them going to public schools. And this happened in 1919, which really kind of makes sense because in the early 20th century, we were a heavily industrialized society, so there was a strong need during this time for people to be educated, for Americans to know how to read and write and do basic math. And so a big push of that is, since we were becoming industrialized, it's like, hey, we need an educated society to deal with this industrialization. So we need to get kids out of the factories and we need to put them in school because we are going to need an educated society moving forward through the 20th century. So public schools are an example of a social program. We all pay into that and everybody benefits from it. So now we're moving into the 1930s. A lot of things are happening during this time. So late 1920s through the 1930s, the United States goes through the Great Depression. Economically collapses the United States. We have millions of individuals and families that are out of work, very much struggling. And so this is one of the main times in American history where we saw a creation of a lot of social programs in order to help pull us out of the Great Depression. So the president during this time was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And since he was president during this time, it was his responsibility and his administration's responsibility in order to help put systems in place to pull us out of the Great Depression. So he created what's known as the New Deal. And the New Deal is a series of various types of social programs that were put in place in order to stimulate the economy and pull us out of the Great Depression. One example of that is going to be Social Security Act of 1935. This was the very first old age pension. And as we've learned, sociologists were involved in these roundtable discussions to create Social Security. So Social Security was created out of the New Deal. So like I said, it's the first old age pension. Half of this tax or insurance you pay as an employee. The other half, your employer pays for it. And so this allows people, as they are getting older, to have a little bit of supplemental income to come in to make sure that they can pay for the rent or the mortgage, have food on the table, to kind of give some level of safety net for our aging population.
What was the life expectancy at that point when they put that in place?
Or in the 1930s, the life expectancy? Well, it was definitely much higher than it was during the colonial time. Life expectancy has been steadily rising for decades and decades. I'm not sure what it would be in the 1930s. I would have to assume that it was probably somewhere in the 50s or 60s.
Yeah, I'm just thinking they're probably, at that point, they put that into place. They're not thinking long-term with life expectancy going up and having to sustain.
Yeah, because whenever they put Social Security in place, it would kick in at the age of 65. So it wouldn't surprise me during this time if the average life expectancy was probably somewhere in the 60s, or even the 70s as well. I mean, yeah, exactly. Yeah. The Civilian Conservation Corps also came out of the New Deal, and every state had different ways of using it. And what the Civilian Conservation Corps put a lot of young men, young teenagers to work. And so if they are working and they are earning a wage, then they are spending that money and they are stimulating the economy. My grandfather, before he went into World War II in Louisiana, he was a teenager during the Great Depression, and he was part of the CCC in Louisiana. And his job as a young man was to plant pine saplings around Louisiana. And if you ever go through Louisiana, the one thing that you will see everywhere are pine trees everywhere. And so as a young man, he was able to be put to work. Here in Arkansas, the CCC was heavily involved in building a lot of our beautiful state parks, like Petit Jean. Petit Jean State Park was built during the CCC, and a lot of these young men, they put it together. And if you ever go up on Petit Jean, you will actually see a statue of a young man. If you get close to it, it's commemorating the young men that helped build Petit Jean State Park. So all of this was about, hey, we got to get young people back to work. We got to create these programs. We got to pay them. And if we can get people back to work, then we can pull ourselves out of the Great Depression. So a lot of things we're going to talk about today are going to be the historical aspects that created these social programs. So now that kind of moves us into the 1940s. So during the 40s, we go through another major historical event known as World War II. So Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, pulls us into World War II to fight against Japan, Italy, and also Germany. And so since a large percentage of our workforce had to go overseas to fight in World War II, and back in those days, they didn't go on deployments for 6 months or a year. They came home when the war was over. So a lot of these young men, when they left, they didn't know when they were coming home. They could be there 2 years, they could be there 8 years. And so since there were so many young men that were over in Europe fighting in World War II, there was a strong need to have women come out of the household, take the aprons off, get out of the kitchen, and go into the assembly lines and the factories to manufacture the things that we needed for World War II. Not only to manufacture the things we needed for World War II, but there had to be money actually coming in so people could take care of their families. And that's where you have these iconic figures like Rosie the Riveter saying, yes, we can. And so during this time, it was considered patriotic for women, for mothers and wives, to leave the household and to actually go into the workforce to help us win World War II by working. So after World War II ended, this is where we see an increase of other social programs, specifically veterans benefits. So like I said, my grandfather fought in World War II. He was very, very poor, came from a very poor family in Louisiana. He went out, he was part of the CCC. He then got pulled into World War II. After World War II, he was able to use the GI Bill to send him to refrigeration school. And prior to the GI Bill, the only people that were really going to college back then were people who had money. If you didn't come from a middle income family or an upper class family, if you came from poverty, the odds of you going to college were very, very small. So out of World War II, the GI Bill allowed a lot of these young men that never would have had the opportunity to go to college to finally go to college, which is a great thing, and it's still around today. Another benefit are VA home loans. These are very specific home loans that people who are considered veterans are able to get. The good thing about these VA home loans is that they do not require any money down. So if you've served your country, you don't have to come up with 10% down, 20% down. So zero money down. Another benefit of the VA home loan is that you don't have to pay what's called PMI insurance, prime mortgage insurance, which secures the loan. And today, PMI insurance can cost you anywhere from probably $85 to $125 a month, and it doesn't drop until you have 20% of equity into your home. So the benefit of the VA home loan was also since the loan itself was secured by the federal government, they didn't have to pay any type of PMI insurance. So this also allowed a lot of young, poor individuals who fought in World War II to not only go to college, but to finally become homeowners, which a lot of them, they probably would never be able to do that, especially if they came from extreme poverty. Another thing that came out of this is going to be VA benefits, like VA hospitals and VA clinics to help take care of them with surgeries and also with various types of medical conditions. And so a lot of veterans are using these VA benefits. Has anybody in here ever heard of the Lanham Act before? It's not really talked about a whole lot. It was only around for about 3 years. And the Lanham Act is the only time in American history where we had universal daycares. So just like we have K through 12, where kids from 5 all the way up to 18, they can go to school for free. The Lanham Act was put in during World War II
because the women had to go to work.
Because the women had to go to work. That's exactly right. So since there was such a massive draw for women to leave the home and not be stay-at-home mothers, the Lanham Act allowed children under the age of 5 to go to these daycares at either very little cost per day or for free. So this is the one and only time in American history where we actually had universal daycares. So today we do have certain programs like Head Start and ABC, but these are usually for lower income families. Universal daycare pretty much covers everybody. So in 1946, the Lanham Act went away because World War II ended in 1945. And so if they took the Lanham Act away, what do you think the perspective would be that women should do at that point?
Well, they should go back home because the men are coming back.
That's right. World War II is over. We don't need universal daycare anymore. Women, we appreciate what you've done, but it is now your patriotic duty to go back home. Because if you don't go home, you are taking the job away from who?
The men.
The men.
And they weren't acknowledged in the military yet. Like even the nurses weren't. It was after this war that we finally got recognition in the military. Like we had no rights. They would serve for the military, but they weren't looked at as military.
Yeah.
Like they belonged to part of the government.
So
Yeah.
they didn't receive benefits at that point?
Yeah. No, it was after the war.
You talking about the women soldiers?
And the nurses too. Like all the nurses didn't have benefits. Like that was a big part of our history this semester.
That is interesting.
Yes, and America didn't take on that trait until England, like the northern countries did it first. And then we adapted because women threw a fit. Because we were working and the nurses were over there, but they weren't being acknowledged as that.
Well, they should have been acknowledged. That's a tough job. They were dealing with soldiers being horribly injured.
That's one of the reasons why Miss Barton was a part of like the American Red Cross, like all three. They just weren't recognized.
Yeah. It's interesting because that kind of makes me feel like even that was somewhat part of the women's movement
It was
to bring about
because
more
women,
equality.
Even as nurses, women weren't acknowledged that they should be, and they weren't allowed to like really go to school or do any of that. So it was men that did all those things, and we were like really frowned upon. Miss Barton was actually a self-taught nurse. She was never even allowed to go to school.
Yeah. For a long time, women were treated like second-class citizens.
They were.
So we've gone through the 20s and 30s. We took a look at the 40s. Now we're moving into the 1960s. So during the 1960s, this was a very tumultuous time in American history. A lot was going on here. We had the Vietnam War. We had the race to the moon. We had the civil rights movement. We had the hippie movement. We had the women's movement that are still fighting for equality. Some of the best music ever made was in the 1960s. You got Woodstock. This was a really tumultuous time in American history. But it was also a time of a lot of economic issues as well. So in the 1960s, we also saw an increase of poverty here in the United States. So you had around 22% of American families that were living below the poverty line. And so just like in the 1930s with Franklin Delano Roosevelt to help pull us out of the Great Depression, there was a lot of pressure on Lyndon B. Johnson to help pull us out of this issue with poverty. And so what he created was what's known as the War on Poverty. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt created the New Deal. Lyndon B. Johnson created the War on Poverty. And sometimes this is referred to as the extension of the New Deal, an extension, the adding to the New Deal. So with the War on Poverty, a lot of other social programs were created during this time in the 1960s to deal with the issue of poverty. The first thing we have is Medicare. So Medicare is going to be public health insurance for individuals 65 and older. So whenever it was created, if you were 65 and older, not only did you get the supplemental income of Social Security to help pay your bills, but because of your age, now you got some assistance to help take care of your medical bills. So Medicare was created out of the War on Poverty. Another benefit that's used, program that was created is Medicaid. Medicaid is still heavily used here in the state of Arkansas. This is public health insurance for lower income families. So this allowed lower income families to get the medical care that they need during pregnancies, surgeries, medication, getting your teeth cleaned, dental health. So Medicaid was created during the War on Poverty for lower income families, kind of gave them a level of a safety net. Food stamps also came out of the War on Poverty. There's a lot of Arkansas families and a lot of young Arkansas children that they get to benefit from food stamps. Helps prevent them from going hungry. Job Corps was created also during the War on Poverty, and Job Corps would deal with educating citizens in order to kind of get them job ready, setting up their resumes, giving them opportunities to help get off welfare, get employment, and pull themselves out of poverty. Head Start was also created during the War on Poverty. This is going to be the daycares for lower income families. So if you had lower income families, their small children be able to go to a daycare at a very reduced rate. This would allow a lot of women to go to college, or they would also allow them to actually go to work. Private daycare can be very expensive, so ABC programs, Head Start programs help reduce that significantly to subsidize it to help a lot of lower income families. Pell Grants also came out during the 1960s. And we have a lot of students that benefit from that. I've had students over the years use Pell Grants to become educated individuals, to learn various types of skills, to go off to college, to be able to better take care of their families, to get off of the system, to help pay into the system. The really good thing about Pell Grants being created in the 1960s, if you weren't a veteran where you did not get the GI Bill, if you did come from a lower income family, it really kind of gave you an opportunity to have the dream of going to college. We really kind of take it for granted now about how many people can actually go to college. But back in those days, like I mentioned earlier, the only people who really had an opportunity to go to college are people who came from money or if they served our country. Lastly, housing and urban development. These types of loans also came out of the War on Poverty, and a lot of people here in Morrilton actually are able to use this. They're called rural development loans. And the purpose of these types of home loans is to try to encourage people to go to lower populated areas, more rural areas, to live and work in those areas. So housing and urban development, or these types of loans, the good thing about these is that they are for lower income individuals, and they are also zero money down as well. And what this gave people was the opportunity to have the American dream, to be homeowners. A lot of people who were poor, they did not have the money or the resources to put money down to be homeowners. So it put them in a situation where a lot of them were renters. So with the creation of rural housing development, this allowed a lot of lower income families to finally be homeowners. So all of these kind of collectively together helped reduce poverty by about 50%. So it lowered the poverty level from 22% down to 11%. And all these programs are still around today. So that moves us into the 1990s. So we're now a generation later. So we have President Bill Clinton. And with Bill Clinton, he signed what's known as the Welfare Reform Act. And he is a Democrat. And a lot of times Democrats have a reputation for creating a bunch of social programs and really not reining it in and keeping it under control. He was really more of a moderate, kind of like Barack Obama. So what he did, he actually put even more restrictions on welfare, on unemployment checks. So prior to the Welfare Reform Act, you could be on unemployment indefinitely. There were no restrictions. I'm not talking about disability. If people are physically or cognitively disabled, you can be on disability for the rest of your life. These are people who are unemployed who are not working. So prior to the Welfare Reform Act, like I said, you could be on unemployment indefinitely. Once he put this in place in the 90s, it put severe restrictions on that, because his idea is that, hey, people need to get back to work. They need to work. They need to pay into the system. You can't just be staying at home. So what it created was essentially 50 different welfare programs for each state. And it gave more power and autonomy to each state, because each state was able to kind of set up their own eligibility and requirements for things like Medicaid, WIC, food stamps. The idea is that every state is different, and the state knows the needs better than the federal government. And so if we're taking a look at California, well, obviously the eligibility for California, since it's so much more expensive, would be different than, say, the eligibility for Medicaid and WIC and Pell Grants here in Arkansas, because the cost of living is so different. So it kind of handed over the reins to all the different states to say, you know what, you need to determine what is the eligibility requirements for these programs, because you know your state better than we do. Another thing it did, it put restrictions on how long people could be on unemployment consecutively. So if you're unemployed, you were only allowed to bring in unemployment checks for 2 years, for 24 months in a row. The idea was, if you can't find a job in 2 years, there's a problem. So it would cut you off, okay? The last thing it did, instead of being on unemployment indefinitely for the rest of your life, it put a 5-year cap on it. So throughout the course of your life, we know you're going to have some ups and downs. You may become unemployed, you may get sick, but we're going to give you 5 years max to pull unemployment. After that, you're going to be cut off.
You know, that was also the only time in the century that we had a balanced federal budget.
You're exactly right. It was during Bill Clinton's administration. It was. He did have a balanced budget. You're exactly right.
When you look at where we're at now with our debt, and
Well, it's terrifying. When I started working here in 2008, our national debt was $8 trillion. That was scary. It's over 30 now.
Well, put it in real life perspective. I mean, if you don't have the money to pay your bills, you don't just go keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. I mean,